Alright, I said I'd be back at some point. Time to stop letting the perfect be the enemy of anything at all. What was all that about? What was I just showing you? I've decided to make this video. It's been on my mind for a while, this broad general subject, and I had a nice stimulating talk about this today with some friends. I was showing off some things and I just thought, it's on my mind. I know what I want to talk about in relation to this, so let's just get it going. You may have already figured that the subject is guns in video games, how they feel, what interests me about them, why some are very memorable, why some are not, why there are some games which I go back to and want to play just because of how cool they make the act of shooting a gun in some way or another, and other games which are very popular. They are also ostensibly about guns, they just have no real grab over me. I have thought a lot about this question, what it means, why it plays out the way it does, and I've started to draw some lines, form some categories which I've never seen discussed anywhere else, but they make a very satisfying degree of sense to me, and when I talk about this, people get it, so I'd like to share it with you as well. I've got all these examples on hand that I've been gathering. Hopefully I'm able to make the point and maybe help you yourself think about this subject. I find it very interesting. I hope you do too. And I really owe you guys some stuff. Some of you have been very good about appreciating the things I've put up, and yeah, I'm really my own worst enemy with this, but tonight we're just going to force it out. Something will be up, and I do hope you appreciate it. It's for me, but also for you. Now, onto the subject. So, where to start properly talking about a big, strange subject like this, guns in video games? I believe the way to go is what I alluded to before, which is some video games contain depictions of guns which are very memorable. I go back to them specifically for the guns, and some do not. This is not a clean divide between good or bad games, or games made in one place or another, by one culture or class of person or another, for one audience or another, but there are very clear trends and tendencies which we can notice. If you know me or have listened to a lot of my other stuff, you might already know where this is going, or if you looked closely at those titles I just flashed on the screen, you may have seen for yourself and figured. There is a sort of regional tendency in what I would consider the good ones as opposed to the bad ones. They come from, well, America is considered the gun place, but they're not very well represented in good picks, and places other than America are very strongly represented in the good ones. Generally, I favor Japan very strongly, and I do in this as well, more on that later, but the line that I would draw between the class of people who I believe get it and don't is maybe not what you're expecting, and I have actually drawn a line. Let me show you. Isn't this great? We don't have to imagine the visual references anymore. I'm actually organized this time. I did draw the line. And yes, if you follow that thing, it is roughly an east-west divide, but having thought about this and talked it through with a few friends a few times, I believe that Western sensibilities and Eastern, it's not just Japan and everywhere else, or the Japanese and other East Asians and everywhere else. No, I actually think that what I consider to be the broadly Oriental set of sensibilities, which are notably different to, well, we could say ours, they begin at the eastern edges of Europe. I would say that the Finns, the Russians, and the Ukrainians think fundamentally differently in a few ways to everyone else. I would say there's also a class of difference between Europeans and Americans more broadly, but this is where it really becomes pronounced, I believe, and yes, that swing of the line at the bottom across the underside of Russia is not actually a mistake or something I did thoughtlessly. It's kind of a tangent, but I really believe that it's the strangest thing, at least among the ones in cities who actually work on video games, The Turks have very, very Western sensibilities, while the Russians, Ukrainians, and Finns have very, very Eastern ones. These pictures here are of Savat Yali and I believe his brothers who founded Crytek. Yes, a Turkish guy in Germany founded Crytek and designed, wrote, programmed, did everything for Far Cry 1. And the other big group photo is Tailworlds Interactive, who made Mountain Blade Warband. Kind of crazy, isn't it? If I hadn't been told, in each case I would assume that those games were made by guys who just look like, the project director looks like Mangs and the development staff is just an office full of guys who look exactly like Mangs, but no, Turks. They apparently think just like the most autistic Germans and Northern Europeans. At most, maybe two guys at Tailworlds look a bit like pseudo-Mangs characters, like maybe Mangs if his ancestry was 50% Eurasian steppe horseman. I don't know, but it's very interesting, isn't it? So I have this line, and I'm very proud of it. What does it mean, though? My essential understanding of this is that there are two major differences on either side of this line. The first being the kind of history of these cultures as creators, and this one is one which is more of a blurred transition than a sharp one to the other. This is that on one extreme end in America, video games are dominated by the STEM field and basically seen as their rightful domain, while as you then transition from America to Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and then the other extreme, Japan, the sensibility shifts and it goes from this is the STEM field, it's all computers, it's their interest, it's where it belongs, and the works tend to be very systems and mechanically oriented, towards Europe where there's more generically nerdy guys. I would consider a kind of Julian Gollop to be the kind of archetypal European game development guy, with perhaps Peter Molyneux, who did learn to program but whose sensibilities were perhaps a bit more artsy, being a more transitional figure. As you move eastward, the Czechs who made, I believe they're Czechs, who made the Hitman games, for example, those are very interesting, not particularly technical, kind of weird middle ground of wanting to simulate things and also just present very novel situations driven by their sense of taste more than a desire to build and program things. And then by the time you're in Russia and Ukraine, and also to some extent Finland, there is a lot of Europeanish autism over there. They can produce very computery guys who are also very systems oriented, the kind of chess brain. It's the meme that Russians are the ones playing Heroes of Might and Magic 3 for 30 years straight. But if you look at the games over there, the Russians like Heroes of Might and Magic 3, but they didn't make it, did they? There are a few, I understand, kind of these autistic strategy RPG type things coming out of Eastern Europe, but more generally, when they make anything with decent scale and effort behind it, it's going to be more of a kind of artsy auteur project. The big Ukrainian games being GSC Game World, who I suppose started out more generically you would say they started out making more generically European games, just kind of cool ideas realized by generally nerdy people, and then shifting more kind of ambitious and art house and weird with the Stalker games, which have interesting guns which got kind of apocryphally blown out beyond what they actually do. But then the whole thing of Stalker's reputation and legacy, that is a subject that would take a while to cover with the justice that it's due. The Ukrainians made Stalker, the Russians, what are their big accomplishments? Ice Pick Lodge making games like Pathologic, and Nikita Buyanov making Tarkov. Now, maybe this doesn't make too much sense to you yet, but Buyanov, I think, is kind of the key point of difference where you can really see the different types of people making a fundamentally different type of game, which, if you're not looking closely, looks a lot like what's happening on the other side of my precious line. How did Nikita Buyanov come up with such a game which is ostensibly the kind which exists and was created on the other side of the line, a first-person shooter? But how did he create one which feels so radically different to play and which went to such novel places? Is he just a kind of ideas guy? He just thinks of random things which aren't currently in video games and just kind of throws them at the wall? I believe not. I believe that everything Tarkov is, or at least a lot of it, emerged from a very coherent set of artistic sensibilities and a desire to express a certain kind of vision, using the possibilities of video games as a kind of tool for realizing what is really less of a game made for its own sake and more like a kind of long-living multimedia art project. Kind of this vulgar pop art perhaps, but still art, which is what Nikita's true passion is, not playing or making video games. And then, of course, over to Japan, they basically don't produce big STEM guys at all. They aren't known for being a computer-savvy culture at all. In many ways, they're known for being backwards, but how do they punch so absurdly far above their weight in such a high-tech field? Well, on one hand, they borrow tech guys from the West, and on the other, well, they don't have tech guys drive projects. They have enough to put things together, but pretty much from the start, if you look up the quotes from Hiroshi Yamauchi, CEO of Nintendo, pretty much from back in the days of Donkey Kong, he saw himself as a kind of patron of a new art form and understood that the value of this art form would be in, not in just how many slaves you can shackle to computers making them, but in the people who are actually making them. When Donkey Kong succeeded, he didn't see the success in Donkey Kong. He doesn't think games which have this gorilla and the hat guy, they're going to be what makes us money. He saw the value in Miyamoto. He thought, anything I put this guy in charge of, that's gonna make us money. So that's the first meaning of the line. It's this transition from, which may have been influenced by the nature of these people. To some extent it may have been incidental and accidental, it's hard to say. But this transition from basically STEM and systems-brained cultures to artsy, artist-driven ones. So that's the first distinction. And then the second, which is probably what I'm going to title this video, it's this subject of Oriental object fetishism. Perhaps it's in the nature of the people, perhaps it's just, again, another historical accident perhaps, but what I find is that in games made east of this line, it becomes a more and more notable trend that there's just a fascination with both objects and virtual objects, which are very carefully realized as depictions of the real ones, which is so fascinating. There is a fascination with objects for their own sake and appreciation of the fine things that they are, what they do, and so on. Just what I want to call a general object fetishism, which is something which comes across in a lot of ways in these works, but specifically in this context we are talking about guns and things adjacent to guns, and this appreciation of fine detail is something that I think is very essential here, both in how they realize the things on a pure craft level, and, as I briefly alluded to with Buyanov, I believe that the different sensibilities, they really just drive you to think in ways that the other side won't. This is really getting hard to articulate at this point, so I'll bring out the examples and hopefully you can see what I'm getting at. As you can see here, I've got Resident Evil running in the background, specifically Resident Evil 1. This game is very important for just looking at how another culture might approach the idea of guns. Resident Evil 1 is a particularly good example because in this game it was made over a longer period of time. They were able to render every object in the game in 3 dimensions, which makes it very much kind of the object game. Mikami himself has said that, survival horror, that's just like a marketing thing made up. He considers it kind of an adventure game. It runs on the logic of thinking about space and objects and interactions, and it's a game where one of those objects, or many, happen to be guns, and just it's about looking closely at things with almost a kind of detective's eye. It is about playing as police officers. You are technically a kind of SWAT team, but really what you're doing, it's more like, it's kind of the Twin Peaks inspired Agent Cooper thing of you go into the mysterious room, you pick up the strange object, you find out what's going on, you apply the next thing. The logic of the spaces in especially old Resident Evil, it's kind of Masonic. Shinji Mikami directed and I guess you'd say designed this game. Did you know that he likes watches? It's, again, that kind of object interest. He appreciates looking at things up close and just gaining an appreciation of their fine details. And if you think about it as well, Resident Evil 1 is a game about learning almost to appreciate the mansion and its surroundings themselves as a kind of large virtual object. It's like Shinji Mikami is a man who likes to look inside watches. When you're inside the Resident Evil 1 mansion, it's full of lots of very fine detail. You can gain an appreciation of how it all fits together, and as you learn how to move efficiently through it and work out the secrets inside, it's almost like you're working through a big piece of clockwork yourself, if that makes a kind of sense. I don't mean to get indulgent in talking about this. My point is that fine details, fine exploration of interactions, the sensibility is there, and it does not start with guns, but it extends out into the guns. At this point in time, you could get away with your gun in a video game being two rectangles stuck together and it's just called the gun. That's basically how Silent Hill, which came out after this game, did it. It's just two rectangles stuck together, handgun, big brown rectangle, rifle, and so on. But no, Shinji Mikami gives you really specifically a 3D modeled Beretta 92 FS, which looks pretty damn good for a PlayStation 1 game. And your shotgun as well, it's a Remington 870, I believe. They could have gone easier on this, but everything else in the game is realized to such a fine level. Why would they skimp on the guns? A culture which simply does not skimp is going to realize the guns in a very fine way, is my point, if there is one there. And I hope that that kind of makes a beginning of sense to you here. A point that I often see raised, which it might be helpful to address now, is a lot of people ask, well, not many, but some ask, why don't the Japanese make or seem particularly into FPS? Like the preponderance of STEM guys in making video games, I believe that the Western fascination with FPS was actually another kind of historical accident. Icy Calm, on one of his better days, raised the point that Doom wasn't really doing anything new when it came out for the most part. It was sort of like a simplified dungeon crawler in most ways, and if you look into the development of both Wolfenstein 3D and Doom, they were actually, in many ways, far more conceptually advanced games in their early planning stages. Wolfenstein was meant to be a kind of proto-Hitman game about sneaking around in disguise. Doom was written as a kind of, almost like a Resident Evil style adventure game with multiple characters, a big cast, ambitions perhaps somewhere halfway between Marathon and Resident Evil, rather than the pure gameplay experience that it became. I believe that Doom largely just kind of emerged from id realizing what they had going that was working for them and just deciding to lean into that. Like, okay, the other games have more mechanics and stuff, but we've got this very nice level builder, we've got a cool music guy, we've got nice graphics and stuff, and we can make it feel good to move around and shoot things in a video game. That's pretty cool, that will do it for now. What it came to be, you don't have to watch the videos I did on Doom, I can just briefly summarize, is that it's very much a game and not much of an aesthetic exercise beyond its game elements. I mean, The designs of like cyborg demons are kind of novel, and the sounds and the look of the guns are alright for when this thing came out, but they don't really hold as fascinating in their own right today, and the engagement with all of that is very simple. You hit the button, or if you're playing a port today, you click and the gun fires, and that's about it. The real potential for nuance and expressiveness is just in how fine all of the parts happen to work together, and the fact that you can create very expressive levels and play them in your own way is really where it kind of becomes a work of art again, but not really in a way that was intended. What Doom became, not really with the intention, I think, was it became a kind of game of laser tag against the computer set within various mazes, when I think originally the intention was to create a kind of generally realized adventure through a kind of hellscape. And somehow this just became a whole class of experience that was considered worth repeating forever. When we say FPS, we basically mean something along the lines of virtual laser tag. That might sound like a flippant or pointless distinction to make, but I really think it does when I ask just, why should the Japanese want to make a first-person shooter if they aren't interested in the game of virtual laser tag? There are Japanese who are distinctly interested in guns now and then, or stories, telling stories where guns come out, but specifically if you think about it from scratch as though it's not a kind of default thing for a game to do, what are the advantages and disadvantages offered by the form, and is it really suited to doing that many different types of things? Or is it just kind of a mildly novel, kind of easy to make game that we just fell into the habit of doing over and over again, with no real point to the greater work, just different incidental framings of what is basically Doom over and over again? There are plenty of brilliant Japanese games which have given me very memorable experiences with guns, and yeah, I don't think any of them were first-person shooters, closest example being Killer 7, but that game is really a lot of things at once. I would consider it a kind of multimedia which uses exactly as much first-person as is necessary to convey what it wants, which is, on one hand, a very visceral, up-close experience of handling several different guns, a kind of weird, alternating perspective of observation and then, like, extremely close-up detachment in a variety of characters interchangingly, where you go from third person to first person, and just the way that you go from moving on rails to bolted to the floor looking in first person. Again, that's Shinji Mikami's influence. He likes the idea of you being kind of scared by the contrivance of how you're handling the game. With that said, I can actually show you another example, this one being my favorite one of the ones I recorded. This is an old Flash game, and according to friends of mine who can read Japanese, its title translates to Material Sniper, or Sniper, I believe. This game was developed according to a Q&A on the creator's own site, up to around 2008 when the discontinuation of Flash eventually led him to stop. The guy is actually still around, maintains it so that it can be played on a site where it doesn't run too well. I'm running it here via Flashpoint. There aren't too many Japanese titles preserved there because they had such a strong kind of just basically independent PC development scene before we did. So this is a very nice and strange little historical artifact. If you're old like me, you'll remember the Flash game culture of the time. There were a few different sniper-themed games, but they were, as I kind of said about Doom, they were games. They were basically mouse tag dressed up in some loose aesthetic of a gun and being fired at people or whatever. While I would say that Material Sniper is fundamentally different in that it's not really about mouse tag, it's about giving you this sensation of being a person manipulating a machine. There's no real regard for violence, you're just shooting targets, and there's just lots of attention to detail all over to making the thing very nice, and playing up this feeling that the gun is this kind of mechanical object which you are manipulating through your inputs. Everything is kind of multi-step and elaborate and gives lots of very satisfying feedback. I want to run a couple of clips together to demonstrate a bit of this. We'll take a closer look at Material Sniper in a minute, but just for comparison, here is a successful Western sniper game. Flash again, of course. If you're old and decrepit enough like me to actually remember having played this one back in the day, please let me know in the comments. I'd be interested in seeing if any of you recognize this. If I didn't say, the title of this one is Sift Heads, and I don't consider it bad. It's clearly got its own priorities, and think what we will of them now in 2024. I think it's quaint, and he knows what he's trying to do. He's realizing a vision that's more than just some stupid little novel mouse game. He's got this, basically a little movie in his head that he's choosing to realize using these little animated scenes and these vignettes of basically mouse tag to play the role of action sequences that he either can't animate or thinks would be cooler this way. Maybe it's more work. It's cool, it's multimedia. But you can see perhaps a lack of vision in how using a gun is depicted. When the gun comes out, you are basically a reticle or, like a scope sight detached from anything else. You're just this floating point, basically a mouse cursor, and yeah, you click on the heads, that's it. Compare that to what you saw of Material Sniper. I'll show you more of that properly afterwards. Just look at this and see what you make of it, I guess. It was obviously not made to give you an elaborate sense of holding a gun, but again, that's kind of to the point. To this guy, the gun is just like an accessory of his cool OC mafioso hitman character. And that's kind of, I don't know if this guy is American, I think it's his second language on account of all the typos, he's not a native English speaker. But I want to say that it's still kind of an American culturally informed sensibility to see guns as this kind of weightless accessory of the cool man, Arnold Schwarzenegger holding the death stick just mows down everything that looks at him, or, Vinny, this guy's OC. The gun, you're physically handling it with the mouse, but it has no real presence. It doesn't feel like a machine. It's just things die when you click on them, and that's all there is. There's no real effort to convey the serious idea of a gun. He does go to the trouble of naming the gun you're using in each level, and they basically handle the same beyond a few minor touches, but he did try something. I appreciate that much, but again, that just kind of brings to mind how far off it is compared to what other people were doing. Again, I'm not going to call any one effort better or worse, it's just, again, different people want to make different things, and in one person's mind a gun is one thing, and in one person's mind a gun is another, and that's what I hope to demonstrate with this comparison. Alright, that's enough of Vinny and Sift Heads for now. I want to give you a proper look at Material Sniper now so that we can really appreciate how the differences come out. The first thing you might notice is just how busy this thing is, both visually and with the amount of sound and music layered together. It's very bright and upbeat on every level. You get this sunny days cityscape, very like anime backdrop scrolling, bright flashy graphics, and music that's kind of Ridge Racer feeling. That's really the first thing that hit me, was just how nice this thing was all over, which I believe is very object person and very fetishistic. It's this idea that, in a good way of course, it's this idea that even a game about a gun, because it's the gun as a nice thing rather than an empowering thing, it's a nice and interesting machine, The appeal, the aesthetic, the direction is towards luxury, trying to make this thing as nice as possible. You might notice that when I enter this level, the tutorial for shooting with wind, that she's wearing a different costume to what she was wearing when I briefly showed this at the start of the video. That is a consistent thing that this guy made a lot of different costumes for his protagonist, and she's just constantly cycling through them over the course of this game. It's really fantastic. On one hand, it shows you this, showing you the person in the edge of the screen physically manipulating the thing just gives that extra layer of tactility and feedback to everything. When you pull the trigger, she does. When you reload, she is actually working the gun after you just hit the one key. And on this particular level, you can see it really well. The wind actually blows her clothes and hair. And watch how she reacts when I hit or miss or crit things. She will get like excited when you land the crit, she'll get flustered if you miss, and she'll get like shocked if you try to fire and the gun is empty. It's just fantastic level of feedback. On one hand, again, the extra feedback, and on the other, it just adds to that luxury factor, like the Ridge Racer music, like all the nice graphic window effects and all the rest. Anime girls being around and just reacting in funny ways is just very nice, isn't it? Now, nice as this is, I'm going to skip ahead to something that's a bit subtle, but I think it's very important. I'd like to share this. So we just shoot to the end, mission clear. Then we go back to the menu real quick, and I just want you to appreciate this, that our like in between stages menu screen is the shooting girl in this, sitting next to this apartment window, and you actually have the ability to, you get points for completing stages. You can spend them on minor effects for your gun, or like more bullets in it, or less recoil when you fire. Or, because this is all about luxury, you can buy new backdrops for her little apartment window, which come with changes to the background music. Because this game is all about niceness, all about luxury, just top to bottom. If you're doing a game about a gun, what is a gun? It's a nice, cool, fancy artisan object machine thing. It's a nice thing that a cool person owns, so yeah, this isn't about being the gun, this is about being a person who has the gun. That's a kind of essential difference that I think a lot of Japanese games do very well. And back to this original Oriental thought, it's something that I think they do generally well with the idea of guns in games, is that you play as a person holding the thing rather than the thing itself. I actually just remembered another Finnish connection that earlier I was thinking that possibly the best American gun-feeling game is Max Payne 3, and it didn't occur to me at the time that actually Max Payne was not started in America. Rockstar bought it for 3. Do you remember which country the first 2 games were made in? Yes, it's a Finnish game. It's on the right side of my Oriental line. That's actually how one friend described it to me, which might have been a very important thought in the genesis of all of this. He described the appeal of Max Payne as being that you are controlling a body rather than a gun. And that's very true. The way that you're in third person and the way that you throw Max Payne around is very, just emphasizes the idea that what you're doing is things to him, and, you know, the shooting input is actually, it gives off the sense that since there's such a bodily reaction to everything you do, that you are making him pull a trigger. You are not yourself just a gun floating in space. Whereas, of course, that actually is the impression I get from a lot of games, like Counter-Strike. Do I have a body? Not really, even though there's heavy physical contact to the point you can, like, human pyramid. The way that your arms are just, like, bolted out in front of you. One friend of mine described it as just heavy, like you're just pushing the gun. Sort of like it's a heavy dolly or something in front of you, if that makes sense. Anyway, just the thought that I've had. On the subject of good implementation of guns in a kind of novel way in video games, making them a kind of object, which is one of many which a character uses, that's been done interestingly in RPGs I've noted before. Fear and Hunger, one example I may have raised already, which is Finnish, the other being the unfortunately unfinished Citadel of the Whore by Top Drunky. Now we all know Top Drunky is a Brazilian in a mink coat, but there are rumors that he is ethnically Filipino, make of those what you will. And look at how Top Drunky even has the characters physically depicted on screen in a double of their, generic JRPG sprites, just because he wants you to be able to see them firing the gun in a very intimate and visceral way. The way he talks about this is absolutely fascinating, just the amount of sensations he wants you to be having during what is a JRPG fight. At the same time, he is thinking of how to bring more feeling out of the idea of a gun and the form of a JRPG battle at the same time. Now, Tanaka Yu, the creator of Material Sniper, and Top Drunky both understood luxury very well. It's an essential piece of object appreciation. I believe that it's both the source of ideas which bring something to life and the source of the right kind of attention to detail, which just makes something feel memorable and good to handle. There are games which have done luxury, but not really a tactile physical appreciation of what they're dealing with, and there are games which are physical and tactile which don't quite get luxury, but when you get both, I believe that's when the thing really works. Something that I love about Material Sniper is the fact that you have this kind of light shopping element with points between rounds. Shopping in video games is a great idea. It does give this sense of luxury to everything you're doing, the idea that there is exclusivity which you are breaking through, which you are actually... the idea that you are physically going out and getting things. Resonance of Fate is a game that I'm very fond of. The game has guns which are completely absurd in a funny way, maybe not too relevant to this discussion, but the way that that game does clothes is absolutely brilliant. Fetishist in the best way possible. Just, it looks genuinely good and cool, and it's all about blowing all of your money on designer jeans when you need that to survive JRPG battles. The fact that spending is a serious investment is just, it's a great feeling. It gives off a sense that a thing is something which you are actually collecting and that it is yours, that it has a kind of value. It might sound silly or tangential, but the appreciation of a virtual object, it's a very under-discussed thing. I believe this is all relevant. In Resident Evil, you have to kill and dig around through some insane murder maze to get your nice, wonderful little Beretta 92 FS or whatever it is you're handling. In Resonance of Fate, you forego the power to survive better by investing in more things to survive JRPG battles, because you really like that pair of pants or that shirt. In Saints Row 2, it's particularly cool how you walk into a physical store to get everything: tattoos, earrings, a haircut, a pair of Gucci loafers, a car, or a gun. It makes this power spiking process feel fantastic, even if the guns themselves handle quite badly because it's an American action game from 2008, meaning it is just weightless and kind of absurd. And unfortunately, they do undercut their own sense of luxury through the weakness of their own sensibilities and their unwillingness to entirely commit to anything truly cool. Saints Row 2 was the closest those people got before, as we all know, pretty much castrating themselves and committing a creative suicide, from 3 to the ones after that to the final death move with the last game that made everyone angry. But luxury, that's the subject, and you may have figured, if you're familiar with the games, coming back around, I want to talk about luxury and Tarkov. Battle State games in Russia and Noble Empire games in Ukraine both understand the technical side of guns really well. I love how in World of Shooting, the shooting range game you saw me handling before, guns are these complex multi-step actions to handle. The constant succession of just mechanical beats you have to hit to get this thing to operate consistently and smoothly feels really nice. Just the tactile feedback is fantastic. Very much ditto for Tarkov. In terms of pure how to weapons handle, I would say neither one wins. They're both really, really good. But I would say that Obviously, Tarkov is the more interesting and appealing game, and where Tarkov has the edge is, on one hand, the viscerality of its premise, the extreme risk and reward payout spin on being an online kind of MMO game, but also there is just the luxury aspect, which top to bottom we can make a few very direct comparisons on. Both games have this vague idea that progress is something which should be aspired towards, but don't seem 100% on why in either case, but I believe that Nikita Buyanov's instincts carry him a lot closer to the ideal. In World of Shooting and World of Guns, it's basically a way to drag you along and incentivize a pay-in, which I was happy to because they've clearly done a lot of good work over a long time. But the scale of progression in what is basically a virtual museum of guns doesn't make a lot of sense. They basically just put very light gates in front of access to everything, which is just a bit of like basically looking at what is there before it. And World of Shooting could have, especially since it's about actually handling the guns, whereas World of Guns was just about looking at and disassembling them as 3D models. If the idea is that I am in World of Shooting a guy taking these guns into the range and shooting them, the idea then is that they are mine, I am handling them, and a massive missed opportunity is that the game is built to incentivize hoarding ownership of guns. Instead, you have a point system where you can only have so many invested in guns at once, and the idea which they basically tell you is, yeah, just like buy the gun you need for the course you want to run, and then sink excess points into just giving it a couple of nice little upgrades, most of which don't really show in any meaningful way. And then when you're done with this trial you're trying to do, sell it and buy the next gun. You're basically renting them to the point where I don't even know why this system is in place, since once you can afford a gun once, having sold everything else, then that's it, you have access to it every time. You just have to go through the kind of upsetting and depressing process of selling the last gun that you were using every single time before grabbing a new one off the shelf. If they want to sell a sense of progress, that's not it. It feels more like I'm constantly regressing, which is, it might sound petty, but it really does just make me not enjoy the game that much. I feel like I'm, I don't know, some kind of unwanted guest who's just got to always be careful putting things back. I can't have anything. The whole point of a game about appreciating nice objects should be a sense of like, okay, in a sense I am having them. I'm getting a kind of experience simulating that. That is much nicer than just handling them. And you know, if I'm just handling them, why don't you just let me shoot something cooler? The novelty of being in a shooting range is not that long-lived. They handle nice, but there are other games with nice handling guns. Just kind of a missed opportunity. They have a lot of good skill over there, but can't quite plug it into a working picture. Last thoughts on World of Shooting. Its strength and weakness, I believe, is that they are fetishists for the guns themselves. That's why it's set on a range, and that's why the guns handle in a very mechanically focused way. It's the good kind of fetishism that's grounded in basically guns for the sake of guns. A brief aside here before I get into Tarkov, there is bad fetishism as well, the kind of stalker mod rabbit hole I alluded to before. Friends and I have discussed this a fair bit. A thought that I've had while just thinking this out is, if your country doesn't produce train autists in addition to gun autists, your gun autists are probably not the good kind. I've started saying autist, I should say fetishist to keep myself consistent. The basic thought I have here is that if you have people developing a gun fetish but you aren't otherwise mechanically oriented people, maybe something other than that in the guns is appealing, and what I'm saying is basically, yes, I'm on my psychoanalysis thing again, it's a power fetish. The gun is an extension of a fetish for power. It is a means of fulfillment. People who are into that can get into the finer details of guns as well, but there's something unwholesome to it. I just don't think anything good ever comes from that. I believe that that kind of fascination with guns leads to the modding monoculture of just every video game filling up with some kind of Tiger Strike MPX covered in attachments where a guy reloads it with very absurdly aggressive hand motions to show off how hard he can operate. That's not what the Ukrainians or the Russians are doing. They're clearly operating on something deeper. In the Ukrainian case, I believe it's a kind of good-natured interest in machines mostly, while in the Russian case, I believe it's Nikita being kind of artsy and weird. Now, to tie this together, I have to draw attention to World of Gun's weakest feature, and that will lead us into Tarkov. Here, let me turn on the music for World of Shooting for a moment, just in the menu. You can really hear the poverty, can't you? And it's actually worse when you're on the range. You get a nice kind of quiet hobbyist's ambience if you turn the music off, but if you play on the range with this kind of music blaring, it really suddenly feels like you're playing a super budget title, and it gets very depressing very quickly. The only other game I've played with a similar feeling is other hobbyist games. In particular, it reminds me of the theme to Cabela's Deer Hunt 2005, which is very obviously not a game about violence or power fantasying. It is solely for if you're interested in actually hunting deer. A guy I know told me he knew someone who hunted who was really into this game. Only time I've ever heard of this game being played by someone other than myself. And yeah, I wasn't playing this as an alternative to Halo, it was purely, well, hunting sounds interesting, I'll never do it, let's get into this. Listen and see if you feel it. That same kind of functional poverty. Yeah, not great, is it? Anyway, let's hear Nikita Boyanov's theme music. Yeah, so that's rather cool, but what's the story? Does Nikita have better taste and a bit more money to throw around? Yeah, maybe, but if you look closer into this, the soundtrack is by a guy who calls himself Gene Byrne, a Russian music producer, and if you look a bit further, Gene Byrne is Nikita Buyanov. He makes the music for his own game. In addition to the general concept and the day-to-day running, it really is his big art project. I believe that that's why all of this works. It really is him just trying to make the coolest and nicest thing that he can. And while his taste is not compromised, he is still Eastern European. So luxury is kind of a troublesome concept for these people. What with it having been illegal to have fun in Eastern Europe for like 100 years. Nikita Buyanov imagines a very cool and exciting world full of very nice stuff, but the kind of Russian aesthetic spin on that, which kind of maybe emerged by accident, but I think it's funny it came from there of all places. There are nice things up and for the taking, but who's gonna get them? You or the other guy? And if you get all these nice things, will you be able to hold them? Will you be selling them to increase your power and get more nice things eventually? Will you hoard them and weaken while other guys go all in and get the next load of nice stuff? It's a very cutthroat vision of luxury. Niceness and brutality alongside each other. It makes for a very engrossing game about guns. They are the nicest guns you will ever see in a video game, and they will be violently ripped out of your cold, dead hands over and over again. But yeah, we're going to take a Grach in now and just... Yeah, we don't maybe the guns don't quite feel as weighty as World of Shooting even, but... Yeah, this transcends being a kind of mere hobbyist thing and becomes an artsy project because of Buyanov's eccentricities and inclinations, I think, which are more interesting than those behind World of Shooting, I think. Though they still have more in common with each other than most, I believe, even if I'd even ascribe them to different impulses ultimately. Both have an appreciation of guns as guns, one side as sheer gun machine hobbyists, and the other more as a kind of Oriental artist's fascination with nice and complex things, with a bit of genuine military interest as well. And on the other side, there's the American Doom successor interest in basically playing virtual laser tag forever, with any resemblance to actual guns being vestigial and eventually shed as we develop games like Valorant and Overwatch and work slowly towards what we've been doing all along, which is just making a kind of cutesy, moronic laser tag inside the computer, which is, you know, just kind of for everyone and about as meaningful as a game of laser tag.
See ya.
Just horrid, isn't it? Downright depressing when you think of the aesthetic possibilities that are occasionally touched upon, but for the most part just completely ignored. I don't consider virtual depictions of shooting from a first-person visual perspective worthless, but it is something which is, for the most part, tied up in the creation of games. Very pure games which are, well yes, just games. They are contrived challenges we mess with for the sake of it. We call everything from Valorant to an independent work like The Citadel a video game, but it should be very clear that the latter is not a game in the sense that it is very clearly something spawned from and working towards an aesthetic vision. The contrived challenge element is very weak and entirely there to create a kind of sensory impression at any given moment. And that is something that the shooting from the first-person perspective experience can do, but yes, the games are so successful that this is pretty much completely disregarded, to the point that people very often have a tendency to judge aesthetic and artistic experiences as though they are games, which of course is something you'll probably be quite familiar with if you've listened to me talking about Halo. That's a discussion I think we can swing over the whole internet eventually, but this video, maybe not right now. And I think we'll call it here for now. So if you know me, you know I hate how this is coming out so far, but again, this is for me and you. For me, I'm glad that I've put work into something and finished it, whether it's something good, I don't know. It'd be nice if one of you got something out of this, but we'll see. This is gonna go up. Any kind of feedback would be appreciated. What do or don't you like? But yeah, in the future we'll see what we can do, and I'll try to get back on the little things and again approach the bigger things that I've set up and not finished, and we'll see what we can get done in the future. I know some of you like this channel and wait for more, so I hope this holds you over for a little bit and maybe prods me to get more stuff happening soon. Thanks for watching and listening this far if you, for whatever reason, did. It's for me, but it's for you too.